Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar, What is Reasonable Suspicion Training and Why Should You Care? This is actually a hot topic right now as actually new data came out this week from Quest Diagnostics that found marijuana and cocaine use is at a 12-year high in workplace drug testing nationwide. And this data is based on positive drug test results of those in a drug testing program. So just imagine what the data would look like if you tested those not in a company drug testing program. And that is why reasonable suspicion training and training managers who manage staff is so important, whether it's for a safety-sensitive function or if you have a reasonable suspicion program, a drug testing program in a company policy. Training any managers that manage employees is just so important. And we're going to go into more detail on that today. I'm Luke Kibbe. I'm going to be your moderator today. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. This webinar is interactive, so please submit your questions in the chat box. I'm going to keep an eye on them, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. If all goes well, we can even, Joel, if you want to unmute during the Q&A session and just ask stuff to us live that way, that could work too.
All right.
And then I will mute the phones during it just so there's no background noise. Finally, you're going to receive the presentation and the link of the recording after the webinar. And usually give me about a day. I mean, I'll try to get that email sent out this afternoon. Joel, I'm just muting you on this end just so we don't have the background noise on right now. So I'm have you muted on this end. But again, I expect an email either this afternoon or early tomorrow morning with the presentation, the recording of this presentation, and that should be coming. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm excited to introduce Clean Fleet's own industry expert, Lucas Shaw. Go ahead, Lucas, and you can take it away.
Thanks a lot, Luke. Thank you for joining us today. I am, again, Lucas Shaw. I'm the account manager here for Clean Fleet. Basically, try to got my hands in a whole lot of different cookie jars, and today we're just going to go over basically what's in reasonable suspicion training and the importance of doing it if you have a drug testing program. I just want to make sure to say this ahead of time that this webinar is not does not meet any federal standards for reasonable suspicion training, specifically for any of the Department of Transportation modalities. We'll get into a little bit later what those requirements actually are, but just ahead of time, if you're hoping to be here and then actually be able to be compliant with the DOT, this is not enough. So I'll just make sure going to the next one. So an important thing to keep in mind is that 70% of substance abusers are employed. This isn't to say that the majority of people out there that are employed are using drugs or alcohol, but those people that are oftentimes are employed, and there's a lot of issues that come along with that. 65% of accidents on the job are related to drug or alcohol misuse. 40% of all industrial fatalities are caused by substance abusers. Substance abusers are 3.5 times more likely to be involved in accidents on the job and 5 times more likely to hurt themselves at work. They're almost a third less productive, and they double costs for workers' comp claims for employers and use up twice as many medical benefits. So having a drug testing program in general is good for cutting this down. But it's more than just being able to have a drug testing program. You really need to be able to have supervisors that have the training to identify if their employees are under the influence of drugs or alcohol while they're at work, which is a major concern. So in terms of drug abuse, marijuana is still currently the most abused drug. I don't know if we can put up the link to the website that that myself and Luke were discussing yesterday, but you can kind of take a look at how each state breaks down in terms of their drug abuse. But overall, and this is a study from, I believe, Quest Diagnostics, that the number of positive tests for marijuana is without question the highest. It's more than double the second leading one, which most recently is amphetamines. Back in 2011, it was oxycodone, and you have seen some of those go down, but amphetamines is certainly taking the cake right now. Yeah, here's the map. It's a pretty good breakdown of what each state has tested positive for, and this particular is overall, but if you go down to that bottom left-hand corner, you can see the other drugs. And looking at marijuana specifically, you can see that you can see the regions where the most positive results are coming from. I believe that Oregon was leading the way in 2016.
Yeah, that's correct. Especially for marijuana, it's more than double the national average, and it's the #1 state drug testing positive for marijuana.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of use for that. Thanks for that, Luke. But yeah, if you just kind of want to get a visual idea to just show your employees or your supervisors as well, this gives you a pretty good idea. Now, you can see the states that have legalized marijuana, and this includes medical and recreational. Every single state has laws in place that legalize marijuana in some fashion. Now, I think in the last webinar I did, I believe there are 4 states currently where there is a complete and total prohibition, but most all states even do have laws that have legalized cannabinoids in some way or another. Oftentimes, for especially some of the southern states, it is cannabis oil in use for seizures and some developmental disabilities. But yeah, it's definitely pervasive across the United States. You've definitely seen a major spike in positivity, up nearly 20% in Colorado and Washington. Those were, of course, the first 2 states to make recreational marijuana legal. And you've seen a doubling in fatal car accidents involving marijuana in Washington. Drug treatment centers have seen a spike in admissions for marijuana, especially in people under the age of 18. So definitely, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's an epidemic, but there's definitely lots of it going around. The real concern, especially now, is with opioids. The CDC estimates that there's been an 80% increase in overdose deaths attributed to synthetic opioids such as fentanyl. And fentanyl is a very, very, very addictive and dangerous opioid. Recently, there was a police officer, I forget the state, but in a drug bust, he just touched something that had fentanyl on it, and he overdosed. Luckily, he didn't die, but it's an extremely dangerous drug. And it's, as well, there was a drug bust today for an operation in New York where they found about 19,000, they were able to buy $19,000 worth of fentanyl and some other opioids, and then were able to track down where the people they arrested were producing and storing this. And one of the officers is on record of saying that there was enough drugs in here to destroy a town. So opioids are really, really concerning. You can just look at the what a difference just under 20 years, or just over 20 years makes. I'm sorry, just under 20 years makes, and it's just a massive spike in deaths from overdoses and opioids. Again, in reference to some of these synthetics, the DOT wants to add more of these. Currently, in the standard 5-panel drug screen, I believe they test for 4 different types of opioids. And they want to expand that to include some of the other ones, fentanyl being up there on that list. And this is expected to increase the amount of positives by 1%. So this could have pretty dramatic effects, especially for the FMCSA. Depending on your modality, currently all the Department of Transportation modalities are testing at 25%, but for the FMCSA, if the positive rate goes over 1%, then they have to increase the number of people that they test. So they'll go from 25% for the year to 50% for the year. So if they do end up implementing this and do end up adding some of these other opioids to their panel, you're definitely going to see testing rates go back up to 50%, as this will increase. This is going to increase just by 1% by himself, not even factoring in the fact that more states have legalized medical marijuana, as well as more states legalizing recreational marijuana. So what specifically is reasonable suspicion training? It's defined to describe a set of circumstances that indicate a reason to conduct an assessment of an employee's fitness for duty. It is a reasoned conclusion drawn from objective observations of the individual, and it's used to determine that alcohol and drugs are not the cause of an observed behavior or appearance. What's very important to understand with reasonable suspicion is that you're not accusing the person that you're asking to test of abusing drugs or alcohol. What you're asking them to do is to eliminate that as an option. There are a whole lot of reasons that people's behavior can change, or they may seem tired or irritable, stuff like that. But what this is, and what this test is supposed to do, is to eliminate one of those, and that's being under the influence of drugs or alcohol. It's designed to prevent workplace injuries, decrease costs associated with those injuries, and to protect assets in the workplace. Definitely gives companies eyes and ears throughout the workforce, as supervisors really are the frontline defense here. So RST should be, the reasonable suspicion training should be taken by supervisors, managers, or any employees that are covered by the company's drug and alcohol policy, the supervisors of those employees. Definitely recommended for HR managers and designated employer representatives, senior management, and really, truly, just anyone who's responsible for safety or is directly involved with overseeing other employees that, in the DOT's mind, are people in safety-sensitive positions, and for any other company, people that are operating under your drug and alcohol policy. Again, getting back to the supervisor's role is to identify specific observations of employees' behavior or appearance, and then to confront the employee concerning their requirement to undergo reasonable suspicion testing. It's also the responsibility to alert to changes in the employee's behavior and appearance, and not a specific set of symptoms associated with each drug or class. So in reasonable suspicion training, there are portions of that should go over identifying, like seeing if the person that you're training can identify drugs or can identify certain types of devices that they may see that are associated with drugs, but it's not about sending someone in to test saying like, hey, I think you're high on marijuana. It's that I think that what I'm observing is that you're under the influence of drugs. And it's really key for the confrontation is to focus on what the supervisor is seeing and not necessarily what the supervisor thinks. So it's very important to document, and it's very important to when you go into a confrontation that you have all the information available, including what you can observe. Getting into some best standards and just kind of looking at the history of DOT regulations. This really started in the late 20th century, in 1988, and they began implementing this. It specifically requires urine drug testing, and it was added to the other 4 things that you absolutely have to test for, including pre-employment, post-accident, randoms, and return to duty. And in 1994, the expansion of this included adding an additional 3 million more employees and included alcohol tests to reasonable suspicion. In terms of the length, each modality has a different requirement. FMCSA, PHMSA, and FTA focus on 2 hours of training, and they want to split that up between alcohol and drugs. And you're looking for signs and symptoms associated with use for both. For the FRA, it's 3 hours, including a portion of it that needs to be about suspicion test determinations. And the FAA is similar to that. And for the FAA, they also require recurrent supervisor training. So it's not good enough for you as in the other 4 modalities. You can kind of get away with it. If you do it once, you've got proof that you did it, you're probably good. Where the FAA wants you to continue updating it, they don't necessarily have a specific timeline, but they just want you to continue to stay up to date. So getting into the goals, it's for workplace safety and to protect the public. And that if you do observe behaviors or appearances that indicate possible drug use, that you remove them from safety-sensitive duties. In terms of drugs, any use of it is prohibited, period. So that's why that's why you do urine testing. It's really just a mechanism to determine if the employee has used a prohibited drug, regardless of when or what amount. Again, this gets down to the fact that you're not doing this because you think the person is a drug abuser, and you're not accusing them of being a drug abuser. You're just using this as a tool to eliminate that as an option. The DOT rules require, and this is a very important series of words here, contemporaneous, articulable observations of employees' conduct, behavior, appearance, or body odors. So this has to be something that you can see and document. That's the only way that you can ask your employee to submit to this type of testing. Again, it's very similar for alcohol. This is, especially for the FMCSA, this has a little bit of different definition in terms of the time frame. You really can't, for the FMCSA, you can't drink while you're on the job, and you shouldn't be drinking an hour before your work, and you shouldn't be drinking in between the time you get into an accident and you do post-accident testing. So again, this time frame is a little bit smaller, but it's specifically to identify if the person that is working was drunk very soon, very close to before they came on duty, or if they're drinking on duty. And even if you can make an observation and you really can't determine, and you can't get a test done, you should still remove them from safety-sensitive functions, because the appearance is indicative of being under the influence. These are just some of the 5 things that the DOT prohibits for drug use, and they represent the most frequently abused drugs. It's important to note most prescription drugs are not found in these classes of drugs. However, if someone is abusing their prescription drug, their prescription for for drugs, it will show up if they have if what they're taking has any of these in it. In terms of alcohol, you need to pull someone from safety-sensitive functions if they've got a concentration, a BAT of 0.02 or greater. Technically, you should also pull them if they're between 0.02 and 0.039. The last bullet point goes over that because they can't perform safety-sensitive functions. However, if it's above 0.04, you have to remove them, and they really need to test. So again, going over, if they're consuming alcohol while on duty, that's a problem. If they've consumed alcohol within 4 hours of reporting to duty, that's a problem, and that's specifically for FMCSA. FAA, it's actually 8 hours. If they have alcohol while they're on duty, or if they refuse to take a required alcohol test, and if they do a post-accident and then consume alcohol, if they consume alcohol between when they had an accident and when they were supposed to do a post-accident test, those are really the things that you need to pull. You need to pull your participant from their functions immediately. So again, it gets down to, for determination, it's all about what you can see and document. So that includes a host of things, including behavior, appearance, speech, or body odors. Specifically, in terms of defining these words, contemporaneous, that the behavior, appearance, or body odor exists now when the supervisor is making the observation, and articulable that the observations are specific, grounded in the objective criteria, and capable of being documented by verbal or written expression. This is definitely important here, is that you as a supervisor cannot act on information that you're receiving secondhand. So if you have an employee that says, hey, I think so-and-so might be drunk, I can smell alcohol on them, and then you go over to them and you can't smell alcohol, you have to go by what you can observe and what you can confirm, as opposed to going off of what a different employee is saying. One additional thing that's kind of interesting, the Department of Defense has a little bit different definition for this, in that even though they also include observable and abnormal behaviors, they can also go off of things like arrests or convictions. They can also go on info from credible sources, which is a very interesting definition. And they can also do this if they can confirm some sort of tampering that is done to a previous test. This is basically a worksheet that we have worked out that you can use for documentation, listing, the employee, their title, and then also who it is that's observing and what their role is, and just kind of give a check of the things that they're seeing, as well as some extra notes for other observations that may not be listed, and then the test determination based on that. So if it's like, okay, we need to do if we can smell alcohol, maybe, but we can't, but it doesn't look like what we're observing has anything to do with drugs, okay, well, we're going to do a reasonable suspicion alcohol test. If their behavior sounds like it might be something to do more with drugs, okay, we're going to do a reasonable suspicion drug test, but not an alcohol test. Or both, depending on, again, what you can see, what you can observe, what you can document. In terms of getting help for your employees, what's very important is when you're hiring people and when you have people employed and you have a drug and alcohol policy, you need to really explain to them that the drug and alcohol policy is about protecting them as much as it is about protecting other people as well as your assets. So you really want to, if you can head off and get them help before these steps have to be taken, it's very important. There's definitely some things out there that you can observe beforehand, like lateness, absences, decreases in productivity, poor performance levels, and problem interactions. These are things you can observe, and before you need to take the steps of reasonable suspicion, you can try to cut them off and get those things taken care of first. Some of the most important is that you can't use time and attendance problems or changes in performance to trigger reasonable suspicion, but they could lead to a referral for an EAP. EAPs and SAPs are, that's something that you need to lay out in your drug and alcohol policy if you do work with one, and if your company specifically will pay for it. But I mean, it's definitely helpful if you can head this off ahead of time and get an employee in to get the help they need before you need to take more drastic measures. In your drug and alcohol policy, you really need to address as well identification, why, who, whom, when, and when to test. You should be updating your drug and alcohol testing policy to reflect objectives, what procedures, what tests, and then how it'll be reported. Of course, it's always important to train the supervisors on the purpose of RST, what to look for, what to document, how to interact with these employees in these situations, because confrontation is not comfortable. It's not something that anyone is really comfortable with, but it's very important that you have supervisors that are able to have these conversations with their employees about whether or not they could be a danger to themselves, to others, and to their assets. It's really important to announce the program to all employees. I would definitely recommend having signed affidavits from employees that they've read and understand the drug and alcohol policy as it's written. More than RST, you also need to kind of know what type of testing there is available besides not just urine testing, which is required by the Department of Transportation. But let's say that you have a non-DOT account. There are other ways that you can test for that. And they each have their own advantages and disadvantages. What's great about urine testing is that you're really looking at a you're covering a pretty solid window, 2 to 7 days. That's usually a pretty good. You can get a pretty good idea, and the results come fairly quickly. Of course, it's something that it's the only testing method that they have for the Department of Transportation. But HHS and NRC are also thinking about using it. You can also, if you're a non-DOT, you can have rapid. So you can get those results right away as opposed to waiting for a lab, and you can just kind of get an idea, okay, is this guy using drugs or alcohol? I need to know right now. What's also great about this is that it's the basics, so everyone does it. I know we have clients that do oral saliva testing. That's really more of like right now. Is this person is this person under the influence of drugs or alcohol right now? And again, the window is fairly similar in terms of getting results. There's a wide range of things that can be tested for, and it can also be super helpful in terms of different types of incidents. Reasonable suspicion if you want something that's a little bit less invasive, if you want to be able to just have someone come on site. Oral testing is pretty good for that, or looking at an accident, post-accident. If you've got a guy that's on the road and he doesn't have time to get into a clinic, we can send somebody out, do oral testing, get a result. Hair testing is by far the most thorough because that window is really, really big. It specifically is only looking at 5-panel. In this, we list the ideal reason for testing. I would really say this is probably better for pre-employment because you want to get a look at someone to determine if they have been using drugs before you hire them. You can do it in randoms, but I'd say pre-employment is probably the best method for this because you can get a huge window to see, okay, is this someone that has a history in the last 90 days. What's great too is that besides the 5-panel, which is the most common for the Department of Transportation, you can customize it for your specific needs. And you can include other drugs. You can take certain drugs off. I know that in Oregon specifically, as we've just legalized recreational marijuana, there are certain companies that we work with that have asked to remove marijuana from their drug screens. We certainly do not recommend that at all, but it's something that you can do, and getting a customized drug screen can get at specifically what you're looking for and what you're targeting. But it's very important as well that that's laid out in your drug and alcohol policy. So if you decide to test for a certain amount of for a certain level of drugs, but then you don't want to test for others, but you have a reasonable suspicion that they're using another drug, you're opening yourself up to a liability if you want to test for that one specifically because it's not laid out in your policy. Kind of interesting, again, getting back to the DOD, they can actually change that. Even though they're only required to do a 5-panel, they can additionally add any drugs from Schedule 1 or Schedule 2. They just have to put in documentation for that request with justification. But besides the DOD, you really need to have that spelled out in your drug and alcohol policy very clearly. So just kind of a basic scenario, going in to a restroom, noticing someone's behavior, and seeing them drop something on the floor that looks suspicious. It's very important that you your employees can answer these 3 questions effectively, especially in terms of the DOT, in a way that is DOT compliant. So what action do they take? What information and observations do they need to be able to make a decision for reasonable suspicion? And then making sure that you have laid out in your policy what sort of things that you have. So, I mean, if you observe someone that has a baggie that has white powder, does your policy allow, or is it your company policy that you're able to search an employee? Because in the DOT, you're not necessarily allowed to do that. For non-DOT, maybe that's something that's spelled out. You know, is because in this specific situation, there's not really enough that you could go on. You would need to observe and document a lot more things to be able to effectively say, hey, we need to eliminate the option that you are under the influence of drugs or alcohol here. Let me go back. So that's basically all we got.
Yeah, that's fine. And I'll cover one other scenario, since you're a CDL driver or work with a trucking in the DOT side. So
How's your day? Muted.
there we go. So for example, Fred, he's a 44-year-old terminal manager who also has a CDL, and he drives one of the rigs, and you're shorthanded. You've been conducting a 2-day safety training seminar for all the managers in your district. Fred's classroom behavior and class participation have been annoying and disruptive. He laughs inappropriately, gets up and leaves the room frequently, drums his pencil and keys on the table, and is constantly talking to people seated next to him. One of the other managers approached you during lunch and commented on Fred's behavior, saying, "Man, it seems like he's on something." This scenario, what would you do? There's sort of a couple. There's obviously more digging deeper into it, but for example, you should, specifically for what you should do is you should arrange to talk to Fred privately. So again, the manager talking to Fred privately, because you're the one that's going to be has to observe this. Ask him for feedback on his experience in the safety seminar, just sort of chatting him up, and start observing his behavior, and solicit responses to your statements, and inform him of your test decision. Can you determine a reasonable suspicion test? It can be made anytime that supervisor has the official or job-related interaction with the employer. If he's seeing something, and since illegal drug use is prohibited off-duty or on-duty or off-duty at any time, there's no requirement that Fred be performing safety-sensitive duties if he's driving or not. So if he's, it doesn't matter if he's performing the safety-sensitive duties at the time or not. And then, if he's, things you should be documenting is like, is he disruptive? He's inappropriate workplace behavior and conduct, fidgety, reckless motor activity. That could be sometimes a sign. Talkative, hyper behavior. If you document a lot of that information firsthand, that might be able to get enough information there to conduct a test and send them in. So this is another example, but we can just wrap it up there. Before we end, again, thank you, Lucas, for chatting with us on this topic specifically. Before we end, just wanted to cover a couple things. We do, if there's anything in your drug and alcohol testing policy for your company might need updated, or don't have one specifically, or reasonable suspicion's not in there, then Clean Fleet can help manage and update that, just so you're following the rules and laws and regulations. We can at least guide you in the right direction if you want us to look over it. But we also offer the reasonable suspicion training, the 2-hour DOT required training. If for non-DOT staff members, or if your company policy for non-DOT, if it has more drugs that you want covered than just the top 5 for DOT, for example, if there's you want it shorter than the 2 hours required for DOT, we can customize the training specifically for you, whether it's live in our classrooms locally or online, and then we have a web-based. You go on and watch it wherever you want to watch it and get certified for DOT's perspective. So you can always check that out. And also, oral fluid testing is coming for DOT soon. It's still about a year away. HHS is making some changes on their end and making sure it's good to go, and then usually DOT implements it about 6 months to a year after that. And so we're almost a year away from oral fluid testing coming to DOT. And if you want to learn more about it, the uses, and why it's a good tool or option, you can join us for our open house, oral fluid drug testing open house. It's going to be Wednesday, June 14th. And for online purposes, we have 2 webinar options for our sessions, a morning and a lunch options, just 1 hour. And we're going to be covering the basics of oral testing and its advantages, what the collection process actually looks like, how it can be done. You can have 12 people in a room, for example, and get it all done within 5-10 minutes. It's a pretty cool tool to be able to use, especially for if it's a reasonable suspicion, or specifically if you come on site for a random, or for example, especially for non-DOT, it's a great tool to just get people in at the workplace and get them back to work as quickly as possible. So if you want to learn more about that, there's a link. Again, that's going to be provided in an email. And there's a live option here at the Jubas truck stop in Portland, Oregon, or joining us live on the webinar. And finally, we do have a webinar next month as well that you can join us. It's DOT medical reviews, the medical exam. What's the process? What are the automatic disqualifications that can arise during medical review? What are the red flags that the medical examiners look for? We're chatting with our medical examiners that are in-house, and they're gathering all this information for us, and what they specifically look for. And then we'll be chatting on what to do after obtaining a med card, the whole process, just so everything just goes smoothly on the DOT side of things. So that's wrapping it up. Thank you again, Lucas, for chatting, and we're done with this webinar. So Joel, thank you for joining us, and we'll send out the email shortly of the recording and the slides, and hope to see you next month. And have a great rest of your day.